and to see so many other Rosarians interested in the way in which plants communicate with each other. I was a professor at the University of California, Irvine, in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And Professor Emeritus, what that means is you're old. And retired, which I am. But I was active there for 38 years. I'm going to be talking today about the way in which plants communicate and the way in which they interact with each other. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be using is from the work of Suzanne Simard, particularly this particular book, which is, she has hundreds of publications, scientific publications. This is a popular book that she wrote about her work. She was involved early on working in Canada with the Forestry Service and was dissatisfied with the way in which forests were being managed, where they were clear cut and then tried to replant. And so she ended up quitting her job and going back to college, and eventually became a professor of botany at the University of British Columbia, and did a lot of work that has contributed to this talk. But I'll show you more about the other scientific publications that support what I'm going to be talking about. So we have to start, when we're talking about plants, we talk about the substrate in which they are found. And I'm going to start with the inorganic portions of the soil. Inorganic means it was not living, either previously or now. So that would be things like sand, clay, rocks, loam, and so forth. And that's the foundation that plants grow upon. And then if we consider the plants, they start off, of course, as a seed and grow. They have to bring roots down in order to interact with the soil and provide nutrients and water to the plants. And they need to raise leaves up to catch light and obtain carbon dioxide. And so this plant is growing along on its own. It's a tough environment. It has to go out and find all the things that it needs. It may be competing with other plants. And so this is a lonely existence, and we can tell from the degree of success of seeds that it's a tough life. So let's consider the roots of the plant. And of course the roots go down and they branch into ever finer rootlets. And eventually there are root hairs on here to increase the surface area, to obtain nutrients, to interact intimately with the soil. And that's what the plant has available in order to get nutrients. But if we look more closely, we start to see something else. There are other things associated with the roots, and those are mycorrhizal fungi. So the plants rather quickly develop a relationship with these mycorrhizal fungi, and these are in the soil, and the fungi have the capacity to actually digest material and digest organic material. And that makes even more nutrients available. The fungi can take up the nutrients, and they can provide some of those nutrients to the roots. The reason being that the fungi actually penetrate the roots and have a direct connection with them. So material can go from the fungi into the roots and vice versa. And the types of things that the fungi provide to the plant are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which is what's in fertilizers, right? If you go and buy a fertilizer, it tells you what the amounts of these various materials. But also things like sulfur and zinc and other minerals that are in the soil are obtained by the fungi and provided to the plant, so that the plant actually has assistance from the fungi, and those fungi, as I tell you, can actually digest things. So they actually can do things that the plant cannot do, and they interact with the plant. The plant, in turn, provides material to the fungi. So the plants, through their roots, can take up water, and they can provide that to the fungi. And they also, through photosynthesis, are producing sugars and amino acids and other compounds, and those are provided to the fungi. So the fungi are actually benefiting from their interaction with the plant, and the plants are benefiting from their interactions with the fungi. So this is what we refer to as a symbiosis. There's a symbiosis between the fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, and the plants. Very important for both of them. And this is a picture in which you can see these kind of large white things are the roots of the plant. And all of this fine, diaphanous-like material, those are the fungi. Those are the hyphae of the fungi. And they have a huge surface area compared to the roots of the plant. So they actually have a much larger interaction surface area with the soil and provide nutrients to the plant. So this is I started off by saying that soil is inorganic. It doesn't have any living material and so forth. Not exactly true. The interactions of the roots with these fungi is very important, and they're living material. And the other thing I said was that the plant's kind of on its own, right? It's a poor, lonely plant, has no friends out in the world. That's not true either. It's very important, this interaction with the fungi, and that's one of the first things that the plants establish. Soil also contains bacteria. So once again, it's not just this inorganic material, but there are also bacteria present, and they feed on dead organic material in the soil. That's what their entire food is. And by digesting this organic material, they can also produce nutrients for the plant. That includes releasing elements. So imagine if there's some dead plant material that contains things like magnesium and sulfur that the other living plant could use. The bacteria will actually break that down, make that available in the soil, and then it can be picked up and made available to the plants. And also, the bacteria will break down other types of organic materials like proteins and sugars and so forth, and then excrete products which are beneficial to the plants. So the interaction of the bacteria in the soil with the plants is also a very important aspect of the ecosystem in the soil. When the plants are digesting organic material, to figure out how to get this thing to work here, there we go. In the presence of oxygen, they produce nitrite and nitrate, and in the absence of oxygen, the breakdown of nitrogenous material leads to ammonia. All of those are good fertilizers. All of those are available to the plant and are quite useful. So the bacteria in the soil are an essential part of the ecosystem that's providing the material for these plants to grow. It gets a little more complicated than that when you're starting to talk about bacteria, because there are bacteria in the soil which will interact with nitrate. They'll take nitrate and use it as a source of oxidating material and release nitrogen into the air. So these are denitrifying bacteria, and they actually impoverish the soil. They're actually rather common in a soil like California, where we have warm soil. These bacteria can actually make the soil less fertile. But there are other bacteria present that are nitrogen fixing. So they take the nitrogen, the air around us is 78% nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen there, but we have no use for it. No biological material can use it other than these bacteria, and they can fix it. They fix it to produce ammonia, and that is available then for biological material. And you're familiar with this through legumes, right? That legumes associate with these bacteria. They actually have nodules on their roots, and the bacteria reside in these nodules and are fed by the plant, given sugars. And then the bacteria fix nitrogen and make it available to the plant. So that's what's going on with legumes. And the other thing that the plant does is provide an oxygen-free environment. So it's a rather complex interaction here. But the point is that these bacteria provide nitrogen to the plants, and the plants feed the bacteria. So again, very interesting and complex interaction. And we're familiar with that from legumes. Well, we've all been aware of that. Well, it actually turns out to be a lot more common than just with legumes. So these are families of plant here, different families of plants, and some of them have common names that we're familiar with: legumes and the elm family, birch family, oleaster family, and so forth. These that are in red all have this type of interaction that I described for legumes, and they interact with a group of bacteria that are called rhizobium bacteria. But there are other plants that also have bacteria that they interact with that fix nitrogen, and these families also have that capacity to harbor bacteria that fix nitrogen and improve the fertility of the soil where they live. Some of these have common names. Some of them are so obscure that there's not even a common name for them. But it's not exclusively legumes, although we're most familiar with legumes. Now, you're getting excited, I understand, because you see there, rose family, right? And I understand this audience. I know. I can feel the energy coming back. But I'm sorry to tell you that the roses that you have do not have bacteria associated with the fixed nitrogen. It's actually only one species in this rose family, and it's this particular species that's the only one that has bacteria associated with it. That actually turns out to be the national flower of Isis. So if you're ever in a trivia contest, this is really a handy thing to have. But normally your roses do not have bacteria associated with them that fix nitrogen. But they do have some other very important friends, and we'll talk about that. So let's go back underground and think about what's going on in the plants that we're looking at. So we just pointed out that the roots of plants have an intimate relationship with the soil particles, with the water, with the dissolved nutrients, and so forth. But they also have an intimate relationship with both bacteria and fungi, and that's very important in terms of the ecosystem in which they're surviving. So you can think of the soil around your plant as an ecosystem that the plant is interacting with. And I don't mean that in the sense that, oh yeah, they're interacting with the soil. They are interacting with many other living organisms, and those interactions are very beneficial to both those organisms and the plant. Particularly if nutrients are scarce, then the fungi are critical in providing nutrients, or the bacteria if they're fixing nitrogen or digesting material. And also if water is scarce, then that interaction becomes very important. So let's now get to some of the scientific experiments that people have done. And I want to point out here that what I've done whenever I'm showing you a particular type of experiment, I'm referring to the scientific paper in which it was first described. And so you'll just see those at the bottom occasionally, and I provide that both to sort of support what I'm saying, but also I think it's interesting that some of this work goes back to 1983 and earlier. And there's actually a lot of information about the way in which plants communicate with each other and communicate with other organisms and so forth. This is actually a very well established and old literature that never has made its way into the popular understanding. Well, it's starting to now. People are starting to talk about it. But it's surprising how interesting this is and how much it affects the way in which we think about plants, and yet it really hasn't become a popular understanding yet. So one could do an experiment in which you label water. That is to say, you take water and you're able to follow water because you make it radioactive, and then you can measure radioactivity of water as it moves around. So this is water that has a radioactive deuterium associated with it. And you can label the water, and what you find is if you label one plant and allow mycorrhizal fungi to be present, that water will move over into adjacent plants. And you can separate it, you can remove the fungi, you can do various things. I mean, the water could just be diffusing through the soil, right? But if you break the mycorrhizal connections between the plants, that water will not move from one plant to another. So the plants actually have the capacity to share water and for water to move back and forth. And the conduit for that is the mycorrhizal fungi. With other plants, you can label the nitrogen in the soil. In the fertilizer, it might be ammonium, it might be nitrate. And you do that again by using radioactive nitrogen, and then you can follow that nitrogen from the soil moving up into the plants. And here we give an example of alder trees, where you put the soil, you put the labeled nitrogen in the soil and it moves up into the plant. And it has been found that that nitrogen can move into adjacent plants, and it does so again through the mycorrhizal fungi. And this can be demonstrated by doing experiments where you separate them. This is usually done in the laboratory, okay? You don't go out into the woods and start scattering radioactive material around and try to see where it ends up. But these experiments are done in the laboratory, and where you can demonstrate the pathways by which the material is moving. But what you'll notice here is that it literally can go into adjacent plants that are of a different species. So the fungi are connecting roots of plants from different species, and they allow materials to pass. Well, what are we talking about here? What we're talking about is amino acids. So the nitrogen that's moving is actually amino acids. So these are valuable nutrients that can be shared between plants, moving from one plant to another.
So are you saying that the nitrogen isn't moving as elemental nitrogen, it's moving as part of amino acids?
That's right.
Wow.
Usually amino acids, not proteins, usually amino acids. And so you'll remember that the title of the book that I pointed out that Simard wrote is called The Mother Tree. And so what she was trying to emphasize is, and of course she was working in forestry earlier on, is that if there's a large tree like this in the forest that has deep roots that can go all the way down to the water table, that tree can provide water to the plants around it. And very often it's providing water to smaller plants, younger trees. Remember, not only this, even different species. And so this, in a sense, you can think of that as a well that is supplying water to the plants around it. Both the smaller trees of its own species, and that's the sense of the mother tree, also to other species around it. And of course, we've already pointed out it's being supplied to the fungi, which provide connections between all these plants. So this tree is providing a very important function for the area around it in providing water. And as we've already pointed out, probably nutrients as well. Now, other studies were done in which they looked at birch trees, which you'll remember they can fix nitrogen, and conifers, which cannot. And they were able to demonstrate that sugars and amino acids pass back and forth between these. You can label the sugars here and they'll move over, or you can label them here, they move there. So these trees are actually sharing nutrients. And this is very different than the sort of notion that we have in biology, or have had for 150 years in biology, of organisms competing with each other, tooth and nail. By God, we got to win this battle. That's not what's going on here. These plants are sharing nutrients, And they did a further experiment in which they shaded the conifers. And actually, it ended up there were more sugars and aminos moving in that direction than in the other direction, because this plant now is at a disadvantage. So imagine a young conifer growing in the bottom of the forest, and it tries to find its way up into the light, to get above the tree line, above the foliage there. And early on, it's at a great disadvantage, but it may have help from other plants, and then when it finally gets up there, then it can be a mother tree and supply things for those around it.
Were there any parts of the study that did it seasonally to see if there were different seasonal changes as to the...
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, what about seasonal changes? And there are seasonal changes, of course, here because these guys are losing their leaves in the winter and these do not. And what they found was indeed that nutrients are flowing in this direction during the winter, and then in the spring when there's a huge flush of foliage here, these plants are photosynthesizing so rapidly that it can move mostly in the other direction. But that not only balances out and supports these species supporting each other, but of course that can be seasonally adjusted as well, so that it balances out over the course of the year. Okay, so we've covered the fact that they're providing nutrients, they're providing water. All of this is going through the mycorrhizal fungi, but the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria are also being supported, and they support the plants. Plants face other challenges, and those challenges include attacks by insects, attacks by microorganisms, pathogenic fungi, and the plants activate defense mechanisms when that happens. Just like we do with our immune system, the plants have a system that responds to attacks of various kinds, both physical and biological. And some of the things, we don't need to go into details here, but a lot of these are peroxidases or oxidases that attack the organism that is attacking the plant. The other thing that you may be more familiar with is tannins, because you've probably eaten a lot of them. If you drink tea, right, that tea is bitter from the tannins. And these tannins, they not only are anti-fetans, they not only taste bad. The reason they taste bad, which is why humans drink tea. I mean, we always, Also, peppers have a really nasty compound in them. That's why we eat them. Onions taste bad. That's why we eat them. All of these plants have defense mechanisms. We as humans then eat them, but we don't eat enough to kill us. But tannins not only are anti-fetin, they also precipitate proteins. So this is a defense mechanism. These oxidases are used to attack proteins and lipids. So when plants are attacked, they use these defense mechanisms to protect themselves. Oh, great. Okay. You can move it even farther away if you want. A little closer. All right. So when this damage occurs, the plant becomes aware of the damage. Oops, everybody just do. Okay. And it activates the defense mechanisms, but there has to be a signal from, for example, the leaf that is damaged to the rest of the plant so that the defense can take place. And so the question is, how is this information distributed? How can an insect feeding on the leaf then lead to the plant activating its defenses? Let me digress for a moment and let's talk about how communication occurs in animals, how communication occurs in our bodies. And the way in which we would do that is by using nerves. And nerves have long tubes that are used for long-distance communication. They're called axons. So your nerve has a long axon. Let's say it can go all the way from your brain to your toe. And that axon is used for rapid, long-distance communication. And here's a diagram of an axon, and the little red things in there are sodium channels. Whoa. The little red things in there are sodium channels. And the sodium channels allow sodium to move into the axon. You'll notice that there's a polarity here. The inside of the axon is negative, and the outside of the axon is positive. So a positive sodium moves through this channel, and we call that a depolarization, because by moving a positive charge in here, it destroys that electrical charge there and makes it neutral. So this is the way in which communication occurs in an animal axon. And what happens is that depolarization activates the adjacent channels. And so the adjacent channel opens and depolarizes that area. That depolarizes the adjacent area, and this signal passes along the axon all the way down to the end. It's a very rapid transmission of information from one spot to another. You step on a nail, and within seconds, you go, ouch! That information has traveled to your brain. What happens when the axon action potential makes its way down to the end of the neuron is that it comes to what we call a synapse. And in that synapse, you have sodium channels, but you also have calcium channels. And those calcium channels open and bring calcium in, and that releases, causes a chemical reaction to release chemicals so that the next neuron is activated. All right. None of that has anything to do with plants. None of that has anything to do with animals. Why am I telling you this? The reason this is interesting is that's the way in which we get long-term communication in animals. And how do we know, what is the kind of information that we have that calcium is entering the tip of this cell? It's a tiny cell, it's a tiny amount of calcium. How would we ever know that? Well, the reason we know that is that there are bioluminescent jellyfish, and they have a protein in them which, when it comes in contact with calcium, glows. I'm not making this up. This was, when people discovered this, they were like, oh my God, what the heck? So this protein, in the presence of calcium, glows. So what scientists did then, biologists then did, is to take that protein, or actually the genes that produce that protein, and introduce it into other organisms. And when it's in other organisms, then you can see when calcium is released. And they did that with neurons, and they found that the tip of the neuron, where I showed you there, when calcium goes in there, that glows. That literally glows through the microscope. So this is a very useful protein, and it can be introduced into plants as well. And when it was introduced into plants, it was found that you could crush a leaf here, and if the plant has that bioluminescent protein in it, the rest of the plant begins to glow. So there is damage here, and the message is transmitted throughout the plant, and that information travels throughout the plant so that the defense mechanisms can be activated. I told you that the information in animals occurs along the neurons through the axons, and in plants it occurs by traveling along the phloem. You'll remember from your high school biology that plants have xylem, where water is transported, and phloem, where the sugars and amino acids are transported. But the phloem also turns out to be the pathways by which information is communicated through the cell, through the plant rather, and it is done so with a calcium-driven system. And you'll notice here that here this plant, it was about 300 seconds that had traveled through the entire leaf. So that's rather slow compared to a neuron, right? A neuron within a second, and for short distances within milliseconds. But nonetheless, the information is being transmitted, and it's being transmitted using ion channels, and the plant is able to know what's going on in a different part of the plant. So that's how information about wound damage or insect damage or infection is spread. And the plant's response then, so that's one thing, you need to send that information through the plant. Then there actually are chemicals that are released that are in response to that signal, so the information comes to the rest of the plant, chemicals are released, and then the defense system is activated. So it's kind of a three-step thing. You have to learn that there's damage, you transmit that information, and chemicals are released that activate another set of chemicals, which are actually the defense. We talked earlier about the fact that the mycorrhizal fungi provide a connection between plants and can even connect plants of different species. Well, it turns out that those signaling molecules can pass through the fungi as well. So what that means is that when this plant is attacked, it not only activates its defense systems, but adjacent plants can also activate their defense system because their neighbor has been attacked. So that's another example of how this ecosystem is strengthened by the plants communicating with each other and not only providing nutrients, but providing information about dangers. Again, as you know, some of this stuff sounds so incredible, he must be making this up as he goes. But I just want to keep reminding you that I have the scientific references. There was a very interesting study that was done in Africa. And people were looking at acacia trees that were grazed by large herbivores, antelopes, or as you can see here, giraffes. These trees were actually grazed pretty high. And these trees initiated defense mechanisms. And one of the major ones was that they synthesized tannins to protect their leaves. And particularly after they've been attacked. It's expensive to generate these defense mechanisms, so they don't usually do the defense mechanisms until they're attacked. The same thing is true for our body. We don't produce all the antibodies and do everything that we need to resist the disease until we recognize that we've been attacked, and then we activate our defense mechanisms. And these trees not only activate their tannin, but they also release compounds into the air like ethylene, for example. And I would again point out that this study is from 1994. These are in some cases quite old. I mean, not old studies, but a long time ago. So this has been known for a long time. It's really not made its way into the general understanding of the population. Here are some of the compounds that have been found to be released into the air. You can see they're all fairly small molecules. Most of them are, not something that, there's isoprene or something. Most of them, you can't even pronounce them. They're unusual compounds. One that we are familiar with is ethylene. Ethylene is a gas released into the air. It actually is involved in the ripening of fruits as well, and it's used commercially for ripening fruits. Notice that this too is a 13-year-old study. It's not new material. The fact that lots of plants release compounds that are used in plant communication. So what happened was that for the plants in Africa was that they released signaling molecules, and then downwind trees start to synthesize tannin even though they haven't been attacked. So this was one of the early studies that demonstrated this, and it was quite surprising. So just want to take a second. It's kind of an interesting story. This work that was done by someone who was a veterinarian, and he was brought to this particular problem by the fact that people had taken antelope and had fenced them in with acacia trees that they fed on, and all the antelope died. And they were trying to figure out, why have these antelopes died? And they found eventually, by looking at their diet, looking at their stomachs and so forth, that they were feeding on acacia trees that had very high tannin content. And they were going, well, why do these trees have such a high tannin content? And then they found that when the trees were attacked, they had a high tannin content. Then when they started looking at that more carefully, okay, so one tree was attacked, but why do they all have a high tannin content? And they eventually discovered this process. The author of the paper argued that there was an even more interesting story, not more interesting, but another interesting story, and that is he found that giraffes, when they were feeding, tended to feed and move upwind. And so he was arguing that maybe they're trying to avoid the trees downwind that were reducing more tannin. It could be. I think you also have to consider the fact that when an herbivore is feeding and moves upwind, it's always the predator. If there's a predator there, you're always going to be able to sense it if you're always moving upwind. If you move downwind, you might move into a predator that you weren't aware of. But anyway, it makes a good story. What is true is that the trees release compounds which actually cause tannin to be produced in trees that have not been attacked. So this is a communication through the air as well as through the roots between the trees. So one of the things that people argue is that humans are sentient, and maybe other animals, your dog, your cat, different organisms are sentient beings, meaning that they're able to perceive and feel things. Okay? Well, let's take all the information that we've been talking about here and think about it with regard to plants. We know that the plants are capable of sensing, right? I mean, this is what we've been talking about. They can sense when they're being attacked. They can sense the adjacent organisms. And of course, they can also sense light. They can sense water, the presence of water, and so forth. They can respond. In the presence of light, they'll grow toward the light. In the presence of an attack, they generate defense. They can communicate with each other. If one plant has nutrients, that becomes available to others, or water. And they also can communicate about danger. They can cooperate. They can share nutrients. They can inform each other. They can generate a multiple defense. Imagine if the whole forest is less edible, that's going to make the insects go away to a different forest. And they can plan. We haven't talked about planning much, but think about a deciduous tree. In the fall, the tree takes nutrients out of its leaves and throws its leaves away. And there's still plenty of sunlight. It hasn't snowed yet. The tree does that because the winter is upcoming, right? And how does it know the winter's upcoming? Without a stopwatch. The way our calendar, it's by daylight, right? By the length of the day. So it's planning for winter, and it gets rid of its leaves. Then later on, in the spring, even though there's still snow on the ground, the buds begin to break. And it begins to produce leaves. It's planning for the coming spring, right? If you don't want to use that as an example, just think about producing defensive mechanisms, planning for the insects coming back in the universe. So plants are capable of doing all of these things. So we really need to think differently about plants. We say animals are sentient, plants are just standing there, right? But what we now know is that these plants are engaged in very complicated behavior. Behavior that we don't always pick up on because they are stable, but there's a huge amount going on in terms of the way in which they're interacting with each other and the complexity of their behavior. So let's go back for a moment to what was originally motivating Simard when she was looking at plants. And that was that she was working for the Forestry Service, and she was aware of the fact that this is the way the forest often looks. Then we go in and we clear cut that, and then we plant something like that with the notion that that's going to replace the forest. But now that we know about the kind of interactions that are going on in the soil, the interactions that are going on between the plants and so forth, this is a very poor reconstruction of what was originally a forest. This is perhaps a better example of how to restore the forest, or at least to have, an ecosystem that is viable. Here you have mother trees that are able to assist other younger trees growing up. This whole system is going to survive much better than that monoculture that I showed in the previous picture. And this is probably even better. Here you have trees of various ages, various species, and some deciduous and some not. And this is a much more viable type of forest. It will grow faster and it will be more resilient. And so this is what she was working on. These ideas have now expanded past forestry, and people that are in plant cultivation now are becoming more aware of the role of the mycorrhizae. And these ideas are starting to be used in things like tomato production and other commercial productions. Because this is now very well understood, not well understood, but at least people are aware of it and are beginning to study these interactions. So, what does all this have to do with roses? Because that's really what we're interested in, right? So, let's think about this in the context of our rose gardens. So I started off talking about inorganic soil, but soil is obviously much more than that. And it's not only chemically more complex, but it's behaviorally more complex. If we think about the ecosystem that's in the soil and how that relates to bacteria and fungi, plants, and even animals, insects and earthworms and so forth, it's a very vibrant substrate for the plants to be engaged in. And, we also think about organic gardening, and when we talk about organic gardening, we also are often thinking about, well, we don't use pesticides, or we're not using inorganic fertilizer, but it's much more than that. Organic gardening is really involving yourself with the ecosystem of the soil around your plants. So I'm going to take a short digression here. When I was a freshman in college, I took a plant physiology course, and we talked about fertilizers. And inorganic fertilizers could provide all the nutrients that your plants need, but they probably don't. So there's a mnemonic device, it's easy to say, mnemonic device that we learned, and it describes all the elements that plants require for growth. So it's C. Hopkins Cafe Mighty Good Mnemonic. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, iodine, nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, iron, magnesium, boron, and manganese. Other elements are there, but these are the ones that are needed for plant survival. So just putting inorganic fertilizer, which doesn't contain all these things on there, is not providing everything that your plants need. They may respond anyway, but organic fertilizer, organic material will contain these things, and it provides a lot of nutrients for your plants and other aspects of the environment. So let's think about what can organic materials in the soil provide. For one thing, they provide tilth, so hold water and increase the air in the soil, making it easier for roots to penetrate and survive. You need to think about providing organic material in the soil as a way of feeding the bacteria and fungi. Because we've talked about how the bacteria and fungi are so important for the plant's survival, but they need feeding as well. And so that's another thing that organic matter does. It can modify the pH. The pH is the acidity of the soil, and it tends to make the soil neither terribly acid nor terribly alkaline. It tends to sort of modify it and keep it in the middle where the plants require it. But I think about when you put organic material in your garden, think about that you're feeding the ecosystem. Because there is an ecosystem there around the roots. And what you're really doing is you're feeding that ecosystem, not so much the plants as the ecosystem, including the communication between the plants and the communication between the plants and the fungi and bacteria, all of which are dependent on these mycorrhizal fungi. So we've talked about how these organisms interact in complex ways, supporting each other. The plants communicate actively with each other, sharing water, sharing nutrients. They can communicate through the air, if there's a danger, or through the roots. And so you need to think of your flower bed as a hotbed of communication and interaction and multi-directional signaling. Something that we don't really, when we look at our flower bed, we're not thinking about, oh, there's a lot going on here between the plants and with the microorganisms in the soil. So Peter Beals wrote that whether or not roses should be grown with other plants is a matter of some argument. I'm not sure why he was saying that, whether he was talking about aesthetically, whether that was some argument about whether roses look better that way, or whether he was talking physiologically and ecologically. I'm not sure. But it is an interesting question. In this case, notice that here are lupins, that's a legume, and here's the rose. And those two plants are certainly interacting with each other, unquestionably. With the legume fixing nitrogen and the rose having a lot of photosynthesis. So we need to think about what's going on, not only with our plants and with the soil interactions with each other. Here is a picture of the of the Garden of the Rose at the National Garden Society in England. And you'll notice that the roses are growing abundantly, but they're with other plants, they're close to the grass, they're close to the trees, and the roses are doing very well. This is not always the way in which we see rose gardens, but these are clearly doing quite well. This is Peter Beals' garden, and here the roses also are doing quite well, but they again are interacting with grasses and trees and shrubs of lots of different species. This is David Austin's rose garden, and beautiful roses interacting closely with grasses, you would think, oh my gosh, that really needs weeding. It's a terrible garden. What does David Austin know about roses? But clearly these are doing quite well. So we need to think about that. Maybe some of the things that I said today would cause you to think a little differently about how you treat the soil, what the soil is doing for the plant and what's happening down there, and the way in which we design our gardens and how the plants interact with each other. So here is a thing where the plant says, do you think humans communicate with each other? And the other plant says, how could they? They don't have roots. Yeah, I guess that's a crazy idea. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm glad to answer questions.